Ah, hello, good evening, everyone. Now you can hear me. How are y'all doing? Thumbs up? Yeah, it's a lovely, beautiful evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this Len Robock lecture tonight. And I want to thank, first of all, the Robock family, who, through their generous donor support, has allowed the Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences Department at the University of Wisconsin in Madison to be able to host this lecture series along with a number of other events that supports our students in the department. And we're grateful to be able to do that. And I'm especially grateful today because I get to introduce a friend of mine to be our this year's Len Robock speaker. So here's the first thing you should know about Dr. Asmeret Asefaw Berhe. She gave two TED Talks in 2019 and 2023 that collectively have 2.8 million views. I doubt any of you can beat that on any YouTube video of yours. Here's the second thing. For 3 years, Dr. Berhe was the director of the Office of Science for the Department of Energy. You know, that one, the agency of Oppenheimer and nuclear energy and particle colliders and world-famous labs that one rattles off like names: Argonne, Brookhaven, Livermore, Oak Ridge. Maybe less known to some here in the audience is the enormous investment DOE also does in climate science and biological science, including running some of the world's most advanced computer climate models on the world's fastest computers that we call exascale machines, providing core structural biology and computational biology to develop, as we learned at dinner tonight, solutions to COVID in record time. That was DOE. Still, what's someone who's the Velasco Chair Professor of Soil Biogeochemistry doing in these places on TED and running DOE? The same thing she does everywhere she goes, which is being a force of nature, improving the science, and making the world think critically about the foundational role the soil under our feet plays in, well, everything. This is what we'll hear about tonight. So we're excited to have you visit from your home as faculty at the University of California, Merced, where her lab conducts all sorts of fascinating research in soil science, geochemistry, global change science, and political ecology. Dr. Berhe traveled a lengthy road to California, receiving a bachelor's degree in soil and water conservation from the University of Asmeret in Eritrea, slowly working her way west, later with a master's in science and political ecology from Michigan State, and then further west to a PhD in biogeochemistry from UC Berkeley. She then received a prestigious President's Postdoc Fellow, joint with UC Davis and UC Berkeley, and then later joined the faculty at UC Merced. Professor Berhe is also a fellow of the American Geophysical Union and the Geological Society of America. She's a member of the inaugural class of the U.S. National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's New Voices in Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And I told you two things, and here's a third thing that you should know that's near to me. Asmeret is a friend of mine, and since she's been at Merced, one of the very exciting things she got to do is she hosted my very first grad student as one of her researchers in her lab, and that would be Ben Sulman, whose mother is sitting next to her tonight, and who Ben is now also a DOE scientist at Oak Ridge National Lab. So what a small world and a full circle to come to. So coming in from the house of Rufus the Golden Bobcat, please welcome to the land of Bucky Badger, Professor Asmeret Berhe.
Thank you so much, Anchor, for that really fun and very generous introduction. I really appreciate that. I'm delighted to join you here today. Madison has always held a special place in my heart for many different connections that I have with your campus. And so I was really honored to receive the invitation to be this year's speaker and tell you a little bit about the work that I do in my lab at UC Merced and some of the adventures that I've had at Washington, D.C. in the recent past. So let's start. I will tell you a little bit about soil and why does a soil scientist care so much about climate change and the important role that soil plays in maintaining the Earth's climate, and then talk about a topic that's very dear to my heart and broadening participation of people from all walks of life in STEM and in the academy, and which is actually part of the most important part of why I decided to join the Byron Harris administration as director of the Office of Science. And so I'll tell you a bit about that. And so kind of tell you a bit about my path. As you heard, I traveled from East Africa, beautiful place in the Horn of Africa, where I received my undergrad degree and kind of moved, as you heard, westward until I made it to Merced. And I've had an incredible career. I'm fortunate to have had many different leadership and other roles in my university and in my science community, as well as in national efforts and engagement. So I'm going to try to kind of distill some of it a bit and share with you some of the exciting parts as the way I see them, and why I think it's important for all of us to think critically about soil and inclusion and things like that. Okay. So my lab at UC Merced, as you heard, is a soil biogeochemistry lab. What that means is in my lab, we study cycling of critical or plant essential elements in the earth system. In particular, we tend to focus on carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, but every once in a while, other essential nutrients enter into our work too. And we study, most of our work is in the soil system. We're soil scientists, and I know many of you are atmospheric scientists and have interest in atmosphere, so I don't know how many of you might have peered down into the soil under our foot, but if you were to dig a pit, this is kind of an idealized profile of what the soil looks like. And in particular, though, what I'm interested in, what happens to soil and critical processes in soil when there is sudden, especially a large physical change in the environment, whether that change is happening because of global change that might have to do with change in temperature, changes in precipitation and associated hydrologic flows into the soil, changes in land use and land cover that occur largely because of human actions, changes that occur because of lateral redistribution of topsoil because of erosion and fire, which is a very important driver of change in the ecosystems near where I live. And typically, we study the impact of these forcings in the soil system and the responses that we see in terms of the rate of cycling of these essential elements, in particular, how it affects organic matter dynamics, the dynamics of the carbon reserve in soil that most of us recognize as. And then we study broader questions about soil health. What happens to soil and all the living things on land that depend on soil when the soil's health is compromised and when it gets degraded because of climate change, human actions, and a number of other things. And every once in a while, largely because of my background in political ecology, we tend to study bigger societally relevant questions. So if you've never heard the word political ecology before, it's basically a field where you apply political economic theory to help explain human-environment relations. Why human beings engage in activities where we're using resources, but we're also degrading resources that we depend on for our livelihood. And these societal interactions play very important roles on how and when we can also engage in rehabilitating degraded ecosystems. I especially study the political ecology of land degradation, soil, and what happens to when it's degraded. And from time to time, we've also asked questions about the role of soil, and in particular soil health and soil quality in human and national security. That's not the focus of my talk today, but if anybody has questions later, we can get into that later. I love soil. I think that's one thing you probably take away from today's conversation, or if you've ventured into my talks or other things. I think soil is the most fascinating thing that we have on the Earth system. I love studying soil. I love teaching about soil. And it's particularly important to me that we do this teaching and learning and researching about soil in foundations that are grounded in principles of inclusive excellence, something that I personally think is a cornerstone to everything that I try to do in my own lab and hopefully in our institutions too. Okay, so why am I so excited about soil, right? I'm sure somebody's thinking of that question. Largely, it's because soil represents the difference between life and lifelessness in the Earth system, right? That 6 foot or so of soil that covers the land surface is the difference for why there is life, and not only there's life, but also life thrives on the Earth system. There's more life and more diversity of life in soil than anywhere else in the Earth system or anywhere else in the universe or multiverse that we know of, right? And so that 6 foot or so soil that represents, that kind of almost is like, you can think about it as a veil that's covering the land surface, is a reason why we're able to eat, not just us, but every living thing on land is able to eat. Every living thing on land is able to breathe clean air, get access to fresh water, safe water, enough water. Literally, we're standing on structures built on soils, right, with things that came out of soil in one way or another. It's an important medium to recycle our waste and recycle kind of the cycling of the biogeochemical elements that we talked about, the biogeochemical sites of essential elements that we discussed, that are critical also for the Earth's climate to function the way it is. So really the difference between life and lifelessness. In fact, there used to be a very famous soil scientist here, right here in Wisconsin, who used to say that all of us are just temporarily not soil, right? Came from soil, we'll be back to soil, just temporarily for this brief moment of time, we're not soil. So that's really, I think soil's important, right? I think we agree. Okay. And the other really fascinating thing as a scientist is also the fact that soil is the most complex biomaterial that we know of in the Earth system. And so much of that complexity actually comes from the organic matter that's in soil. And mind you, the organic matter that's in soil is actually, under most circumstances, less than 5% of soil mass. Unless we're talking about soils in, say, wetlands, or soils in high latitude or high altitude ecosystems, where it's too cold for the organic matter to decompose efficiently. In that case, then it could be a lot more than 5%. But under most conditions, for most mineral soils around the world, the less than 5% by mass. But the less than 5% by mass that is made out of diverse types of organic matter, like you see here, that is remains of plants and animals and microbes and things that used to live in soil, that abundant and diverse constituent of a heterogeneous mix of organic matter is so important, is underpinning the complexity in soil, and is also underpinning so much of the critical life processes that are in soil. So think about, for example, on the physical side, soils that have a lot of organic matter can hold on to a lot of water, a lot of nutrients, can support plant productivity, can also kind of regulate thermal balance in soil, because more organic matter means darker soils, and be able to absorb more solar radiation, which is critical in high latitude, especially environments. The organic matter that's in soil, with all that diversity and reactivity, also actually plays an incredibly important role for what we call cation exchange capacity. It just means how much and how fast and in what form the plant essential nutrients can be made available to the plants and microbes that are growing in soil. And this is such a critical process that, remember, plants, to be able to complete their physiological cycles, they need 17 essential nutrients. 13 of them, they can only get it from soil, right? And so very, very important from the chemical side, also important for pH buffering and resilience of that ecosystem as a whole to resist against change, and is the major source of food and energy for living things in soil. So I think we're all on the same page now that soil is fascinating, but also really, really important, right? Okay, so come to the climate side of things. So why does soil play such an important role in climate? Largely because the plants that grow in soil are able to continuously take out CO2 from the atmosphere during photosynthesis, use it to build their biomass, and over time, either the biomass of those plants or the animals that feed on those plants makes it into soil, and is in the soil then that some of it stays for diverse periods of time, until microbes that call soil home decompose that organic matter and release some of the carbon back into the atmosphere again as greenhouse gases. Depending on the conditions we're talking about, it could lead to release of CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and a bunch of other gases. But ultimately, when you're thinking about from the climate perspective, what you really want to think is how much is the amount of carbon that's being taken up by plants relative to the amount that's being released by these microbially facilitated decomposition. Because ultimately, in terms of thinking about how much carbon can be stored in soil, what will matter is that balance. At every whatever time scale you want to think about, it's the balance that's important. And I like to explain this to folks, this balance, as like our bank account, right? Ultimately, what dictates our wealth is not just our income alone or our expenditure alone. It's the balance of our income relative to our expenditure that dictates how rich we are, right? So that is ultimately what matters in terms of soil, and soils that are able to bring in more carbon from the atmosphere relative to how fast it's being decomposed in soil, are able to build a really rich carbon bank, if you will, in soil. And this is partly responsible for why there is more carbon, a lot more carbon in soil than there is in plant biomass around the world. So think of all the plant biomass you can imagine. It's a lot, right? And obviously a lot of carbon in plant biomass. But relatively speaking, soils actually have a lot more carbon. And so much of the carbon totals, if you think about it from a carbon density perspective, is in either the peatlands or wetlands. And the reason here is that, as I mentioned earlier, in either peatlands or wetlands, during the growing season, plants are able to photosynthesize. The carbon buildup happens in their biomass, and the plants, of course, die when it gets too cold again or too wet in some cases, or the end of their lifetime. But the biomass, once it enters the soil that is either cold or wet, depending on whether we're talking about wetlands or peatlands, in those conditions, the microbes that are most efficient to break down the residue, which are heterotrophic aerobic microorganisms. So microbes that depend on decay of dead living things under oxygenated conditions. Those microbes can't effectively operate, hence carbon builds up over long, long, long periods of time, hundreds of thousands and longer. And there's still a lot of carbon, just lower density across all sorts of ecosystems, like you see in here. People like me think not just how much carbon is there, and there's a lot of carbon in soil, but also in what form does it exist, in what association with the minerals that are also in soil does it exist. So as a reminder again, there's more carbon in soil than the vegetation, but that's actually not the end of the story. There's more carbon in soil than there is all of the carbon in the vegetation around the world, all the carbon in the Earth's atmosphere combined and twice over. So a lot of carbon, right? But the reason why then it becomes really important to think about where that carbon is and how fast it is decomposing is because, as you can imagine, with those relative pool sizes of carbon in vegetation versus atmosphere, in soil versus atmosphere, that any small change in the rate at which carbon is decomposing from soil and entering into the atmosphere makes a big difference for concentration of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and hence the warming in the atmosphere. And so people like me try to study how fast do the different pools in carbon decompose. One of the ways you can think about this is, so what this kind of magnifying glass is cartoon. I'm not an artist, so obviously not a great job here, but you get the idea. What that cartoon is trying to highlight is the fact that there's a lot of carbon in soil. All those dots are supposed to be representing the orange dots carbon. Some of it just exists freely in the soil without any association with the minerals. And remember, the minerals in soil are the products of long periods of breakdown of rocks to form soil. So some of it doesn't necessarily have tons of association, but a lot of the carbon, and the carbon that was going to persist in soil for a long period of time, i.e. cycle slowly, that is going to be important for that long-term preservation and build-up of the wealth in the soil carbon bank. That carbon is going to be associated with the minerals, partly because that association with minerals makes it harder for the microbes to decompose it. Not impossible, just harder for the microbes. So it slows down its rate of decomposition. So some carbon is physically trapped inside mineral aggregates and clods. Some of these small aggregates in particular are very stable. They're very hard to break down for microbes. If they want to break them down, they have to invest a lot of energy. And so if there's other carbon, free carbon, they will just work on that and leave that alone for a while. And some carbon, some of those organic compounds that you saw are reactive, as are the surfaces of the minerals in soil, in particular clay, the fine sized particles in soil. And so they can actually form chemical bonds to attach themselves to the surfaces of the minerals. And when the carbon is attached to the surface of the minerals, then as you can imagine, it's also harder for the microbes to decompose. It requires energy expenditure. And so they don't tend to break it down as efficiently. So if you're thinking about long-term storage of carbon in soil, what you want is not just for carbon to keep coming into soil. You want some of that carbon to end up in those associations, as much of it as possible. I want to reiterate again, we're not trying to stop decomposition, because decomposition is important. It's a very important ecological process, because decomposition, you can think about it as your checking account. Right? You get income, a lot of carbon comes into soil, but some of it actually has to be spent. We have to pay rent, we have to pay for food, we have to pay for transportation, maybe school, right? It's like a checking, the money that's in our checking account that's important for our running our life. Decomposition is like that. It's a very important process by which all the nutrients that plants took up from soil when they were growing up, all that nutrient is locked on their biomass. The way it's going to be unlocked and released in the soil so that the future generations of plants and microbes can grow in soil is via decomposition. So that is more like the checking account, and typically the fast decaying pool is going to be that pool that doesn't have association with minerals. But if carbon makes it into those mineral-associated pools, and if it slowly, even a small amount of carbon, makes it into that mineral-associated pool over time, you build up the savings account, and that's how you build up, basically, wealth in soil, right? All good? So that's what we study. And the reason why the soil sequestration bit becomes important, and I know this is a repetition for some of you in atmospheric science, of course, but the idea here is that, of course, there's a lot of carbon we're releasing into the atmosphere with burning of fossil fuels, changing land use. And it's always important for me to remind people that, but the rate at which the atmospheric concentration of CO2 keeps increasing is roughly about half, because the natural ecosystems, including land, keep sequestering some of that excess CO2 we're releasing into the atmosphere. And of course, the ocean. But nobody thinks that this is a good idea to continuously overburden the land and the ocean part of the ecosystems, right? We've all heard of what's happening with ocean acidification. With so much CO2, becomes, the oceans absorb some of that CO2, it dissolves in water, creates more and more acidic conditions. The other part of the concern that a lot of people have is that even though, yes, the land ecosystem continues to sequester some of the atmospheric CO2, but we're continuously degrading the soil system that actually makes that possible. This is from a paper that a bunch of us came together to write a while ago now. Just shows you the extent of soil degradation globally. Gist of the story is, like, every part of the world, soil is getting degraded, right? Through a variety of processes that have to do with human activities. Some of it is erosion, some of it is deforestation, then erosion in some cases, some of it is chemical pollution, a variety of different human actions that are causing large amount of degradation of soil globally. And the implication of this is important, right? It means it's compromising the ability of the terrestrial ecosystem that was responsible for some of that sequestration by land to continue to do that. And this was a kind of an estimate of what is likely to happen to the soil's ability to store carbon by the end of 2100. And everything that's in green is showing you areas where we think by 2100 there's going to be more carbon stored in soil than there is right now. That's obviously not many places, right? Human actions are seriously compromising this. And then everything that's in the warmer colors is areas that are losing more and more carbon. The warmer it gets, the more carbon it's likely to lose. And especially in areas that are experiencing rapid warming, right? That, like the Arctic, large amount of carbon loss that is expected to occur. In fact, some folks came together and wrote that 2017 PNAS paper that estimated that in the last 10,000 years or so that human communities have been engaged in agriculture, we have lost about 120 petagrams of carbon, 120 billion metric tons of carbon that was in the top 2 meters of soil, was lost from soil to the atmosphere. And the fastest rate of that loss happened in the last 200 years or so since the Industrial Revolution. So the land ecosystem and the ocean were really bailing us out, you could say, right? We've only been facing about half of the responsibility of the CO2 that we keep releasing into the atmosphere, but the ability of these natural ecosystems to continue to bail us out is seriously getting compromised. And that's a problem, obviously. And I like this chart from a paper that was published a few years ago now to demonstrate kind of, okay, yes, the Earth's CO2 concentration has been changing. We know this, some of it from the records, paleo records that we have from ice cores and modeling, some of it from the observation in places like Mauna Loa. We know things have been changing. The different colors here are representing basically how long before present the Earth's CO2 concentration was where it is in this figure. So if you have anything that's red, is in the tens, if more than 50 million years before present. Anything in the yellowish colors is millions of years, and then anything in the blue is similar to what we're experiencing right now. And I like this figure in particular because this is the first part of the figure that shows the past of where we've been. This is the choice that we have in the different paths that we can choose to follow going forward, right? Assuming business as usual, everything being the way it's been the last couple of decades in particular, plus the growing human population, there is a scenario out there that we can end up in a pretty high emission scenario that's unlike anything the world has seen in tens and millions of years before present. Hopefully, we won't have to deal with that, and nobody wants to deal with a world that is that warm, obviously. Or the other option that we have is we reduce our emissions. We seriously do everything that we could possibly do to cut down emissions and replace our fossil fuel burning with renewable energy. And we end up in a middle of the road scenario, but that is still unlike anything the world has seen in millions of years, right? Or we can actually get our act together even more seriously, so reduce all the emissions that we can reduce, plus we adopt a climate-smart ecosystem management practices that allow us to draw down some of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere and store it in more stable pools in places like soil and other options. And that is really the more sustainable option that we have on the table, and really that allows us to bend the curve, if you will, towards more sustainable world. This is from a work that we did with several members of my group a few years ago to synthesize kind of all this information that's out there right now on nature-based climate change solutions, in particular soil, and kind of summarize where the options are in different kinds of biomes. And what you see here is the amount of CO2 that could theoretically be taken out by natural ecosystems in terms of CO2 equivalent per year. And basically, petagram, again, same unit, the billion metric tons of carbon. And the biggest kind of opportunity that we have here is forests, right? Forests represent the incredible opportunity that we have, either by protecting the forests that we have from deforestation and degradation, or reforesting some of that degraded forest and forests that have been removed by all sorts of human actions whenever possible, improving the management of the forests that we have. It's a huge opportunity there. And then there's a significant amount of opportunity also in working land, right? In agricultural areas, cultivated systems, grazing systems, that also present significant opportunity for how much carbon can be sequestered. And then there are wetlands. And wetlands are a very interesting case because they actually can sequester a large amount of carbon fast. But the geographic limit, the climate envelope where wetlands can thrive is limited, globally speaking. So that constrains, if you will, in terms of the total amount of carbon that could be sequestered in wetlands. But all of this is incredibly important for many, many reasons, right? It's really important for the climate future that we all want. But I don't want to leave you with a message that says that soil sequestration and soil protection and forest protection is just important for soil, for carbon and climate-related reasons. It's important for many, many, many other reasons too. And so I think my plea to anybody who would listen to me talk is that we need an ecosystem perspective. We need to make sure that we're recognizing, yes, soil can be an important, powerful solution. Nature-based solutions are extremely important solutions, but we don't just protect nature for the sake of climate. We also protect nature because it's important, and we need to, for many other reasons, and we need to avoid kind of being trapped in this carbon tunnel vision that unfortunately some people tend to be. And I think that it's important that we recognize these many other kind of interlocking, if you will, variables that are key for life processes that are affected every time nature is degraded, and that are really, really important for addressing not just climate, but so much of also what we depend on. Here's an example of what I mean by that. This was a paper we wrote with a number of people from across the world, organized by some scientists in Australia, to really highlight the connection of soil carbon management for planetary survivability. And one of the tools that is used here to assess this is the United Nations Development Program's Sustainability Development Goals. All the goals that the world population came together to set 30 of them, 30 goals, if you will, to think about what does the world need to accomplish so that human communities can live and thrive, regardless of where they live, regardless of where geography placed them. How can we make sure that human communities around the world can thrive, can live happy, healthy lives wherever they are? And if you think about a variety of these, and here you have these 13 of them that are laid out here. And if you look at these 13 of the 17 options, the SDGs, so think, for example, zero hunger. We can't ensure zero hunger of populations unless we have healthy soils. And healthy soils deserve that, actually require there to be healthy amount of carbon, and carbon sequestration allows us to address the goals of healthy soils. Or even think about clean water, affordable energy sources. Think bioenergy, for example, responsible consumption and protection of nature and human communities, climate action, and so much more. Soil is central to 13 of these 17 essential goals the human community set. And not just soil carbon is specifically important. And so it's important that we maintain soil carbon sequestration. It's important that we do it, but we should do it because it's critical for soils to be healthy, which is critical for people to be healthy, which is critical for our planet to be healthy. Okay, so my kind of closing message on soil is I hope I've convinced you that it's really important for regulating climate. Soil has been a victim of human actions and climate change. But if we get our act straight, it also offers powerful solutions for addressing climate change. And if anything I said is interesting, Ankur mentioned the 2 TED Talks, and you could get them either through my website or the TED website. I'm going to kind of put a pitch for the comic, though, which is one of my favorite things. It's a collaboration that we did with our Center for Humanities at UC Merced to basically distill the message of the first TED Talk into a 4-page comic that I personally love as an outreach tool, especially for kids. It's a free 4-page colored comic that you can print from my website and use it for whatever you want. And just a wonderful way to kind of communicate the importance of soil and to as many people as possible. It's also linked to the TED website under the talk if that's helpful. Okay, so I'll go into the second topic that I wanted us to talk about today, and inclusive excellence in STEM. I personally think those of us in the academy and anybody who cares about education and science really should care about inclusive excellence first and foremost because it's the right thing to do. It's a matter of social justice. Many of us do these jobs that we love. We depend on the public to support the jobs that we have and the education and the science and explorations that we do. And it's only fair that every member of the taxpayer public also can have that same opportunity. If that's not reason enough, it's also really, really important for addressing some of the major, I would say most of the major issues that we have to address right now in the Earth system. Many of us at this point are familiar with how lack of diversity and inclusion in the health sector have cost women for generations, right? Have cost people from minoritized communities for generations, have intentionally or unintentionally inflicted pain and damage and suffering to so many communities. Many of us are so aware of the environmental justice issues that have plagued so many minoritized communities, poor communities that have been affected for decades and decades at this point, right? And climate change is doing the exact same thing. the most vulnerable communities, economically speaking, or from a power perspective, that had very little to do with climate change are facing the most destructive elements of climate change. And they obviously do not have the power or the privilege that we have to argue that they should be included. And so it's our job. It's critical, of course, for food and nutritional security of the growing human population, development of a future workforce that is tech illiterate, that is properly trained for the green economy that is upon us, whether we like it or not. Economics dictated at this point that it's going to happen, right? And so that's really, really important for many reasons. One Health is a really important principle that I believe in. Health, viruses, climate do not care about political boundaries, people's race, gender, whatever, right? They don't care about these arbitrary ways we've separated ourselves into different groups. Everybody can inflict damage on everybody in the whole world. The pandemic, I hope, has taught us enough lessons on this, and hence why we have to invest in as many people as possible being involved, educated as much as possible, and have access to science. Of course, biodiversity is self-explanatory and harms. Again, if all of that is not reason enough why we should care about inclusive excellence, it's also good for the bottom line. I think there's no shortage of studies at this point, especially from the tech sector, to demonstrate how diversity leads to more economic benefits for companies and different sectors. It's also incredibly important for the nation's national competitiveness and national security. Not that long ago, the same group of students that sued the Ivy Leagues for racial preference over admission sued the Naval Academy, and the federal court case decision came down. The court agreed that it is important for the Naval Academy to maintain race as one of the factors for admission to their academy, because it's critical for national security. The Navy cannot just be one group of people or a few groups of people. It has to represent the nation. It's a matter of national security, and it's extremely important. I don't think there's a more powerful argument than that. I'll let the judge make if you haven't read it. I think it's an extremely powerful argument. Many of us have been involved in this work for many years. We've written a lot on this space. Some of them are in the room. And so I hope this is important. Specifically in the academy, especially in areas that have to do with climate, I think it's particularly important that we recognize the critical importance of broadening participation, because we cannot do right to address climate change and make sure that we don't repeat some of the mistakes that happened historically with the kind of suffering that so many communities have suffered. And if we're not going to repeat some of the mistakes that we've done and ensure that the climate crisis is solved in an environmentally just way, we have to start from our own homes and make sure that our own institutions are actually welcoming, and our own institutions are actually training as broad segment of the population as possible. Why do I care about this so much? Because we're all here in earth and environmental sciences. Many of you will recognize this figure from a very powerful paper that was published in 2018 to demonstrate the lack of diversity in the earth and environmental sciences fields. And this was the data from the NSF's survey of urban directorates at the time. And at the time this paper was published, across the entire country, across all those fields that cover earth and environmental sciences, a grand total of 11 Black people received PhDs across all of those fields, right? And the numbers are even dismal when it comes to Native Americans, Alaska Native, American Indian. It's always just been terrible. 3 people total across the entire country. And then, compared to the number of Hispanic and Latino identifying people in the country, 49 is also very, very terrible number, right? So this is a problem. It was highlighted in 2018. This is from the latest data that NSF published from the same survey. That the column in the middle shows you the percent of the total PhD recipients that identify in one of these groups. What you did not see in those surveys, though, is the fact that all those fields listed in there had a grand total of 0 Black people that received PhDs across the entire country. Many earth and environmental science fields are in those. Many fields that fall in there. So the problem's not going away. We have to ask ourselves the hard questions of why. Why is this a persistent problem? I tend to think the large contributing factors here are inequitable distribution of resources and the climate in our own workplaces and the culture in the academic and other scientific workplaces are part of the issue. What am I talking about here? This is from the data that was compiled by the American Physical Society, APS, to basically demonstrate this inequitable distribution of federal resources that are invested for science and technology. What you're seeing here are, so the blue boxes are percentage of institutions that receive federal funding, and the proportion of the total funds they receive relative to the students is marked in there. So basically what the message here is that about a quarter of the PhD granting institutions receive 90% of the federal funds for research. I'll say it again. About a quarter of the PhD granting institutions of this country receive almost 90% of the federal resources invested for science and technology. All the other institutions that serve most of the students from minoritized communities, students in rural areas, and students from historically underrepresented groups, minority serving institutions, historically black colleges and universities, tribal serving institutions, tribal colleges and universities, all of those fit within those institutions that are collectively battling over 10% of the federal funds for research. I don't think any of us would argue that those few institutions deserve so much of the resources and they're way better than anybody else out there that they should continue to do that. I think talent, genius, is kind of really sprinkled all over the world in roughly equal distributions. What is not in equal distribution is access to resources and opportunities, right? And that is a fixable problem. And if we really care about it. In fact, this paper, one of the conclusions they make is that this current structure perpetuates a lack of diversity and fails to build capacity across a spectrum of institutions in different parts of the country. Okay. And then the other part of the problem with culture and climate in our academic institutions is that we're not all in a level playing field. Don't get too hung up on the images of the two individuals. They're representing a person from a group that's historically overrepresented in STEM and a person from a group that's historically underrepresented in STEM. And what is indicated in these ladders and the different obstacles you see along the way is the fact that, yes, STEM education, academia is hard for everybody. We all have to work our way up those ladder steps, right? But some of us get guidance along the way, some of us get support, others get obstacles put on their way. And from the very beginning, before we even start grad school or in academia, all the way through the ladder is an extreme kind of obstacle course, if you will, filled with so many challenges people have to overcome before you can reach the top. And even if you do reach at the top, you do so after experiencing tons of burns and scars along the way, right? And don't just take my word for it. This is an image that we commissioned for our paper representing this hostile obstacle course. But the scholarship is rich in this. There is no shortage of scholarship that has been done over decades and decades and decades to demonstrate exactly where the problem is. And this is a tiny sampling of the incredible amount of scholarship that has been done in this field. A project that is very, very amazing and dear to my heart that we've done, Erica's here, the lead PI, is also worked specifically in our field of geoscience, for example, to work really, really hard to empower geoscientists to transform our workplace culture and climate so that we can do better all around. And one of the findings from this work is that we ask people across large surveys, the largest survey of earth scientists that had been done, a climate survey in partnership with multiple professional societies that are listed here, ask people if they've experienced hostile workplace climates, exclusionary behaviors that may include kind of discrimination, harassment, bullying in the workplace. And those who say yes, we ask them a follow-up question and say, has that made you wonder whether you want to leave your profession? And guess what? About 50% of Black women and white non-binary respondents say yeah. It's hard enough for them that they're considering, or many, of course we didn't capture the people who've already left, right, in many cases. But yes, it's a major factor. And this is also true for people from across many minoritized communities in STEM. So it's a pretty serious problem, right? So these two things collectively were a big part of why in 2021, when I got an invitation from the Biden administration to join the administration as director of the Office of Science, a very big part of the reason why I was compelled to say yes. Because this is an opportunity to not just write papers and advocate about these really, really important issues for science as a whole, but also be part of the solution. Right, try to be part of the solution to these issues. And the director of the Office of Science position is a lot of things, incredibly exciting position, where I was in charge of one of the largest science funding agencies in the country, but also get to be a cheerleader for science as a whole, which is an amazing privilege to be in a position like that, to advocate for a lot more people to do science, not just do my own science, but facilitate and advocate for a lot of people to do science, and be a science diplomat to allow US scientists to participate in all sorts of things that some of it people may never know how that access was facilitated, but make sure that US science and scientists be part of the international community, that funding, access, and opportunities are facilitated, and even cheer on the next generation of scientists as they compete for one of the largest science, kind of spelling bee type of thing, but science-related competitions and national competition where that's facilitated by the Office of Science, and the final of it takes place in DC. Okay. And the Office of Science is such an important part of the US science and technology ecosystem because it's a massive office. The last congressionally appropriated budget that I secured before I left the position put the office's budget at $8.24 billion annually. For perspective, NSF gets about $10 billion. And NIH, a lot more, but so the peer institution is NSF. But the Office of Science is different than NSF. First of all, it's the major science funding agency for basic research in the physical sciences, so the largest science agency for physical science, broadly speaking. And the major area, science core programs and engineering and technology offices that the office supports are listed in the very top of this figure that you see, including computational sciences, basic energy science, which includes chemistry, material science, condensed matter physics, geoscience even is in there, biological and environmental research, including support for the climate research work that we heard about earlier, including that office. Basic biological and environmental research was also the office that started the Human Genome Project that some people might not know. So amazing things, and plus series of physics-related programs, including high-energy particle physics, nuclear physics, and fusion, which I know is big in your campus here at University of Wisconsin-Madison, plus the isotope production office. There's also an office of accelerator development and research. And I'm going to tell you why that is important in a minute. Plus, all of these programs, largest supporter of all these programs, plus the office manages 10 national laboratories, 28 scientific user facilities around the world, which collectively serve tens of thousands of researchers that are either employed in the labs, about 25,000 that are employed in the 10 national laboratories, plus another 40,000 or so that use the facilities annually from around the country and around the world. A major agency, if you will, that is responsible for and tasked for delivering scientific discoveries and major scientific tools that are needed to transform the nation and the world's understanding of nature, as well as advance the energy, economic, and national security of the US. That's kind of the tagline in the top that you're reading. Okay, so you heard some of these names in the labs before, so I won't belabor it. So the ones with the logos around the map are the Office of Science National Laboratories. DOE actually has 17 national laboratories, 3 of which are national security labs. So Livermore, Los Alamos, and Sandia that are not on this map. There are other 4 that are applied science labs, like Idaho National Laboratory for Nuclear Energy, for example, or NETL and NREL, which NREL is actually in Colorado, that some of you might know, not far from NCAR, more on the renewable energy side of things. And then all these stars are different institutions that receive funding from the Office of Science. I don't know why the star here is showing up as red. Weird thing, but okay. But those are the national laboratories, and these are the user facilities that I was talking about. So there's a lot of pretty pictures here. I will give you just an example of a few. So what these facilities are, especially important for those of you who are grad students and early career researchers, these are basically facilities where the federal government makes investment in tools that are either too expensive, too complicated for even the biggest academic institutions and other research institutions to be able to run by themselves. So the investment from the federal government comes to the Office of Science. The Office of Science is tasked with setting up these facilities, typically inside one of the national laboratories. And then, though, the access is granted freely for scientists across the country and across the world. All you have to do is write a user proposal and be able to get granted access in one of these facilities. In fact, my own start in the Office of Science, after I had a mentor at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, started kind of partly because myself, Erica, and others spend a lot of time at the lab that is at the corner, the top corner, the Environmental Molecular Science Lab, which is just the most fascinating facility if you do spectroscopy of any sort. The most fascinating place in the world. It's like the biggest toy house that you can imagine. And what's amazing, though, is you write your proposal, you go there, PhD level scientists are tasked with training you to be able to use those facilities and be able to run your samples, do your research, get access to these federal facilities that are there to serve you, and then help you do great work, right? And the others, just to give you an example, so the top line is mostly computational other than EMSL, and the exascale computing machines that you heard about, the fastest in the world right now. There are two of them in the Office of Science, one at the Oak Ridge Leadership Computing Facility and another one at the Argonne Leadership Computing Facility. A third one was just opened in the national security space at Livermore. So the three of them are the fastest high-performance computing systems in the world right now. But guess what? They're not just the fastest. They're also the most energy-efficient machines in their class. And that's the kind of ambitious goals that the office sets for these big facilities, is that we don't just do them, we have to do them better than anybody can and make sure that as much as possible, you continuously to improve efficiency. There's also JGI here. Some of you in the bio side of things, I'm sure know, for all sorts of genomics analysis. There are fusion facilities here, including the 3D that's in San Diego, and also NSTXU that was down and is going to be up and running at Princeton Plasma Physics Lab next to the Princeton University campus. And then there are the, I like to joke that if there was, those of you who are old enough, you remember Kits R Us and Toys R Us. If that was still a thing of this generation, Office of Science could say accelerators are us, right? So all the circular things that you see here, particle accelerators, light sources, neutron sources, all of those are run by the Office of Science, largely speaking, all the powerful ones in the country. And all the amazing physics-related work that you hear about is also, and then also the Office of Science ensures participation of U.S. scientists in a lot of international endeavors, including the U.S. part of in the CERN kind of accelerator and CERN in general for U.S. scientists. So much just amazing stuff. And to make sure that people have access to it and money doesn't become an issue, the office has invested a lot of time to think about how can we support researchers, students, to actually get access to the labs, to the facilities. And the top list is a list of continuing programs in the Office of Science that fund undergraduate students, graduate students, even faculty, to go and spend time in the national laboratories and use these amazing tools for science. In the Biden administration, we also started a number of programs, including Renew, which was a program, a training grant opportunity for those emerging research institutions, the institutions that are all fighting over that 10% that I mentioned earlier. The same thing, a capacity building grant, again for those 10% of the institution fighting over that 10%, to make sure that they are better represented and have access and into the world of the Office of Science, which were incredibly well received. Fortunately, as you can imagine, in the last couple of months, not doing so well with those things. The same thing not doing so well is another thing we introduced called the peer plan, which is equivalent to NSF's broader impact statement, to make sure that the scientists that are receiving federal resources from the office make sure that the research that they're doing is not exclusionary in any way. And draw, hopefully, participation from a broad segment of society, including those emerging research institutions. So that was a cruise, if you will, through a lot of the things that I was involved in, and hope we still have some time for questions. Thank you, everybody, for the invitation again.
Thank you very much. And then, yep, turn this on. Thank you. There are microphones on the left or right. We do have about 5 or 6 minutes to take a few questions, and then don't run away, because if you have even more questions, we have a fantastic reception that is going to be up this way out the door. So please stick around for that for the following hour, and I'm sure you can do some one-on-one follow-ups with Asmeret as well. But let's go ahead and open the floor to any questions from the audience.
Or if you can be loud, that's okay.
Is this working?
Yeah.
Yeah. So thinking back to the bar graph of different habitats, where like the largest amount of carbon sequestration was in like boreal or Arctic areas.
And peatland, northern.
Yeah, peatland. So with rapid heating, there's a lot of permafrost. There's lots. Carbon's accelerating. We might be hitting a tipping point, and then there's also methane, which is going to accelerate that. So the size of that graph really alarms me. Is there research that they've done looking forward into, as much as we can tweak the way we're managing land in those areas, what makes the most sense? Like, a lot of them are going to end up being wetland, but is there anything we can do, and is there research on best practices, or kind of where we're imagining how we can sequester more carbon in environments?
Yep. I think just to make sure that everybody's on the same page here, reason why he expressed alarm at the size of that box is because the reason why all that carbon accumulated over hundreds of thousands and millions of years is because, there's photosynthesis, of course, during a rather short growing season in the Arctic and northern ecosystems, in peatlands, but the environment is dark and cold for long periods of the year. So those microbes that are efficient to break down the residue cannot operate. Thank you. Especially those ones that are, kind of efficient in breaking down residue, which tend to be aerobic, heterotrophic aerobic organisms cannot really thrive in that ecosystem. So it's built up over long, long periods of time. But what does warming do? Warming thaws the permafrost and it drains the system, right? And all of a sudden now then it's warmer, it's not as wet. That barrier, the physical barrier that you've had for decomposition that was slowing down its rate of decay from microbes has been taken away, and there's a lot of carbon to decompose, right? And so this is unfortunately, in many ways, the ticking bomb that a lot of people worry about, because it's not even a one-time problem, right? The more warmer it gets, the more it decomposes, and the more it decomposes and releases CO2 and methane into the atmosphere, the warmer the earth gets, and then that just keeps fueling a positive feedback loop. And so, yeah, there's a lot of efforts to try and think about what can we do? How can we even understand how fast the system's gonna react? How fast, how much time do we even have to react here, right? And as you can imagine, managing these ecosystems, not the easiest thing in the book, right? Because most of it probably will end up as wetlands. So still relatively slow rate of decay, but now instead of CO2, we're releasing methane, not a great option either way, a more potent greenhouse gas. So in fact, DOE, the Office of Biological and Environmental Research, has funded one of the largest research activities in the Arctic called NG Arctic for a long periods of time to quantify and think about what is it that we could possibly possibly do. So that was actually a 10-year kind of effort that's wrapping up and moving on to a modeling phase right now so that we can think about a variety of different scenarios and possible alternatives. But there's still always going to be smaller efforts funded by DOE and many other different agencies, and the Arctic Alliance for research that's out there in the world also does a lot of similar work in Sweden and other places. So a lot of people are trying. The alternatives are not many. There aren't many good alternatives in this type of ecosystem, right? Other than preventing that system from thawing and draining, there's not much we could do. And as you can imagine, there's very little people can do to prevent this other than slow down warming. That's the biggest solution we have, but obviously one that we're not exercising fast enough. But the rest is more kind of engineered approaches that a lot of people are trying in a variety of different settings to slow down the drainage, to slow down the land from collapsing in one way or another, and a variety of related kind of exercises. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? Just a quick follow-up from me, which was, you mentioned a lot of promise about nature-based climate solutions, locking carbon in soil. What is the risk that pushing hard on that actually kind of works against fossil fuel emission reductions, and to the extent that it actually encourages people to kind of be like, hey, we can keep going and doing more because we can lock. Like, have you kind of thought about how we navigate attention, especially in living in a state where they're very actively doing this type of work?
Yeah, it's an end proposition for me. It's not or. If we're not reducing emissions to the maximum extent possible while we're doing nature-based climate change solutions, we're doing it wrong. I think it's a simple question for me. It's a simple answer for me. It's not an or, it's an end. And we have to do it because it's, as I said, we have to do it. It's non-negotiable, not just for climate, as I explained, for many other good reasons why we have to protect soils. And we have to do both at the same time. So the way I presented it here is it's plus. It's not just the climate smart ecosystem management, but also emissions at the same time with it. Yeah, I hear you. That's a risk that some people, plenty of people have loudly argued and continue to argue that, even oil companies buying credits to continue releasing emissions, that's not a thing that would work for anybody, right?
Let's take one more.
Yeah, thanks. My question is regarding human population growth. Do you see the human population of the planet as stabilizing or even starting to decline? And is carrying capacity vis-a-vis the human population, is that still a consideration that has to be looked at as far as the ability of the planet to carry an increasing human population, if such increase is something that we have to continue to anticipate? Thanks.
Yeah, I'm not a person who studies human populations. In fact, I like to make jokes sometimes that I don't study living things. When they die and their residue enters the soil and becomes carbon, that's more interesting. Just a joke. But obviously you make good points, right? It's human population continues to grow, and we are expected to see, another billion or so very soon in the world. That's not a trivial problem. It's a really major issue, especially if we do not fix our, the way we lead our lives, right? The business as usual scenario, not taking us any good places. I'm going to be super general about this, but the research on this is clear. Where human communities have better livelihood, better economic means, better education, population growth slows down. Unfortunately, most of the world's not there. And so it will continue, population will continue to grow one way or another. The question becomes, can we make sure to address all of those things that the SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and others are trying to address, to make sure that human communities don't feel like they have to give birth to 6 kids so that they could raise 2, right? which unfortunately is the reality in many parts of the world.
Well, thank you for sharing your words. I hope the next time all of you step outside onto a part of the soil, you think very differently about what you're stepping on and where you're all headed to. And so please stick around for reception, and let's give another hand to our speaker today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.